Okay, thank you, Theo, for your kind words. It's great to see so many familiar faces, so many colleagues and friends around. I will, we divided our talk into parts. I will start and Paula will continue. So I'll share our screen and let me, are you seeing it?
Yep.
Is it okay? Okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
So in this talk, we propose to address history of science and technology as a disciplinary unit. And this is not just an article of faith, but it really comes out from our joint work and the perception that it's very productive to look at history of science and technology together and not as two separate entities. And we will be exploring how this unit, as part of humanities, may help to address problems of concern to present-day societies. We start from the well-known theoretical background provided by Science and Technology in the European Periphery and Tensions of Europe, which were two independent research networks which coexisted in time from 1999 to 2014. This was, of course, an accident, giving way eventually to other groups. They both share the will to dissect the conceptual meanings of what is Europe. Having this framework in mind, we then address two different topics, crises on the one hand and Anthropocene on the other. We believe that both STEP and Tensions of Europe agendas and the debates on crises and the Anthropocene call for a longue durée approach and for an attitude of resilience against both technophobia and technophilia, contributing to ongoing debates by revealing past decisions, strategies, and options that shaped contemporary societies. We deem they are critical to better understand today's society and to propose active agendas that may influence public opinion and policymakers. As such, it is our contention that these two interrelated topics deserve particular attention from scholars in our fields. And so let's proceed to a very brief summary of STEP and Tensions of Europe. They had different, albeit complementary approaches to the history of science and the history of technology. In fact, STEP, for various reasons, concentrated mostly historians of science and Tensions historians of technology, but this is just a fortuitous event. Both encourage national case studies and their relation to larger regional, transnational, and/or European frameworks. STEP's agenda stressed the concepts of appropriation, circulation, mediation, and innovation, and was particularly concerned with the historicization of the notion of what it means to be a European periphery. Approaching local studies and such a theoretical umbrella, it is possible to reinforce the concept of co-construction of centers and peripheries, to go beyond the corset of fixed geographies and to probe the idea of co-construction of what we called moving localities. And it was also possible to bring to the forefront the perspective of active receivers, often dismissed from global accounts based on a simplistic and static divide between the active global north and the passive global south. In their own terms, very reductionist designations. And finally, to fully participate in the ongoing debate on the relevance of science and technology as a global phenomenon, closely related to the discussion of progress itself. Topics such as experts, go-betweens, amateurs, travels and circulation, popularization and its various outlets, textbooks, technopolitical agendas have been under STEP scrutiny. And after the end of STEP in 2014, mobilities and urban spaces have profited from a discussion informed by STEP and often put forward by former STEP members. Together, they have proved to be very fertile territories for historical research that is relevant to the challenges that Europe faces today. The Tensions of Europe Research Network, built on two main interrelated conceptual tools. First, the idea of a hidden technology-driven agenda for European integration, and second, the notions of linking and delinking, which explore the ever-changing asymmetries within Europe and between Europe and the global world. The four main assumptions that supported the research framework of the first edition of the Tensions of Europe, and which gave way, as Theo mentioned, to the Making Europe 6 volumes book series, were first, a longue durée narrative, second, the relevance of material networks, technological systems, and circulation of knowledge, practices, and artifacts, third, the need for placing the histories of Europe in a global, worldwide dynamic perspective, and fourth, the need to review our current understanding of the process of European integration in order to highlight its bottom-up dimension. Beyond its research agenda, Tensions of Europe also encouraged strongly a commitment to contemporary issues, claiming the relevance of history of science and history of technology in the discussion of topics usually labeled as just political and economic. In this context, it is only natural that the follow-up from the first Tensions of Europe program, which started in 2016, and which is called Technology and the Making of Europe's Societal Challenges, has geared towards the big issues of our time, particularly those related to the concept of crisis. This is still uncharted territory for historians of technology, insofar as technology has not been placed at the center of the current analysis of crisis. It is therefore a tantalizing research avenue to understand how societal crises are shaped and are mediated by technology. It is therefore at the crossroads of STEP and Tensions of Europe agenda, and inspired by their conceptual frameworks, that we highlight the two topics, crisis and Anthropocene, as research areas worthy of attention. We believe that both conceptual debates and archival research on these topics promise challenging results and show how humanities, and very particularly history of science and technology, may be relevant assets in discussions going on in present society in topics as varied as resources, migration, security, urban challenges, mobility, pandemics, and environment. They are usually labeled as just political or economic, but it is clear that the multidisciplinary input encompassing reflections on the role of science and technology is fundamental in order to propose solutions to citizens and policymakers. And so let me address the first topic, crisis. The rhetoric of and discourses on crisis are rooted in a wider sense of loss and frustration, very much based on the perception that the human ability to command nature does not lead necessarily to increasing well-being, and that resources are indeed finite. Of course, this is not new in academic discourse and the academic discussions among historians of science and technology. The debate on technological pessimism and skepticism is a vivid example, and the first Kranzberg law, which I quote, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral, is simple and yet effective reminder that trade-offs are usually part of the relationship between humans, nature, and technology, and society, of course. However, the idea of a linear, continuous, progressive, and good sort of growth and progress, which is at the heart of industrial capitalism, is still a doxa, in the sense that for most people, this constructed vision appears to be the only possible vision of reality. The growing evidence that this narrative does not match reality creates a civilizational instability that finds its natural habitat in a series of never-ending slow-moving crises, in a rolling apocalypse of contemporary history, in the sense that there is an ending at sight if humanity's actions in nature and society do not change drastically. Of course, I'm referring to concepts such as slow-moving crisis and rolling apocalypse, which have been put forward recently by the historian of technology, Rosalind Williams, and so let us very briefly look at them. What Rosalind Williams claims is that in order to understand the present predicament humanity finds itself in, the concept of slow-moving crisis is an important alternative to the former long-time notion of crisis as a singular and abrupt and sharp event with dire consequences. So she acknowledges that crises, more than events defined in space and time, are processes which unfold in extended periods and regions. They are part of what she called these slow-moving crises, in order to stress that looking for their causes or for their aftermath leads to unavoidable deadlocks due to their integration in a multitude of interrelated events influencing and impacting each other, and eventually leading to what she called the rolling apocalypse. However, her take on the concept of slow-moving crisis, which we think is very appealing, has also a drawback, and this is a drawback she pointed out very recently in a paper just coming out in Technology and Culture. And this is the danger to easily discard the actors that are part of the crisis, thinking about these long periods of cascading crises as just another natural phenomena that escape human agency. Following her lead, we suggest that as historians, we should be able to use the lenses of history of science and technology to address in an innovative way the concept of crisis. And some questions come immediately to mind. How are crises enacted, entangled, and built across time and space? How do different actors perceive, use, mediate, and shape their interactions in moments of crisis? Are science and technology a cause, a medium, or a solution in understanding crises and their multiple realities? Are contemporary crises shaped by past ones? And are there lessons to be learned? How can we seize these continuities and continuities? Are science and technology the ultimate soft power in the context of crisis? And this leads us to an example which we used in order to reflect on Rosalind Williams' concepts. The context of pandemics we still find ourselves in provides, in our view, a very good illustration of the potential of Williams' concept of slow-moving crisis by forcing scholars to contextualize these specific crises as part and parcel of a long sequence of interlocking events of dimensions going much beyond the strictly medical one. They include human, non-human relations, conditions for disease propagation and for public health control, confinement versus prevention strategies, individual freedom of choice and state control over individual actions, boundaries between democracies and autocratic regimes, various gradations in belief in the value of science and technology in society. As many other historians of science and historians of technology who have used the opportunity provided by the pandemic to show how our disciplinary perspective can enrich present debates, we looked at it within Urban History of Science and Technology in Lisbon. Various chapters of a forthcoming edited volume to appear in the series Cultural Dynamics of Science by Brill deal with public health issues at Lisbon at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century and the protection of the port city and imperial metropolis from the ravaging impact of epidemics arriving mostly by sea. They were the springboard for our revisitation of the theme under the present predicament. We offer in what follows some conclusions from this analysis. Epidemics, as we all know, are part of the web of interactions which mark the urban space, introducing disruptive elements in a fragile balance of forces, either because they suddenly change the status quo or because they force changes in urban spaces and in the behavior of those who inhabit them, from experts to common citizens alike. From the medieval Black Death to COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021, this pattern persists, justifying the renewed vision of urban history as encompassing urban history of science, technology, and medicine. Let us look backwards briefly. As we know, The European rate of urbanization accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries, including both the expansion of large Central European cities like Paris, Berlin, and London, and smaller cities like Lisbon or Porto. The new 19th century city is mostly a Haussmannian city, modern, cosmopolitan, conceived to serve an emerging middle class. Hidden infrastructures, sewage, lighting, water supply, visible infrastructures such as gardens, new avenues, sidewalks, and transport, leisure and consumption areas, as well as public health and hygiene regulations, were at the heart of the new urbanity built by different classes of experts. In fact, scientists, engineers, and physicians formed the new technocracy, which assumed a fundamental role in urban matters and in informing political decisions. But the glare of the Haussmannian city has made invisible to the eyes of contemporary modernity another city within the new city. It was the city of the poor, that is, of the working class, that migrated to the cities and lived in precarious housing and unhygienic conditions and neighborhoods. This city becomes visible during epidemics because diseases found in it their privileged spaces to blossom and expand. This happened in Lisbon during the epidemics of the late 19th century and still happens today. It was from the perspective of science, technology, and medicine that the issue of working class housing and neighborhoods was exhaustively debated in Portugal and abroad in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, not only as a privileged space for the application of techno-scientific knowledge and public hygienist and health policies, but also, of course, as a space for the exercise of power in the sense of Foucault's concept of dispositive. It becomes clear that our case studies stemming from Lisbon at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, including medical debates on the origin of diseases, discussions on the virtues of containment versus prevention, on the impact of the various dimensions of epidemics, medical, social, but of course also economic and political, on the diversity of specific local responses and the call for their articulation with global actions, provides reflections which are useful to assess the COVID-19 global pandemic. Historical research on how societies have dealt in the past with epidemics and pandemics enable to better navigate the current moments of uncertainty and bewilderment and articulate future actions effective in reversing the conditions that stop the world in the 21st century. It is, of course, impossible to predict dates and contours of the occurrence of the next epidemics, but it is possible to create the local, national, and global conditions at the environmental, social, institutional, and political levels so that we cease to be the main agents responsible for the propagation of epidemics. More than reacting, we need to anticipate, and foreseeing means drastically reevaluation our relationship with the planet, with the world around us. If we fail to do this, that is, if we address this pandemic as a singular event and miss to see it as part of a succession of slow-moving crises, following Rosalind Williams, in the coming pandemic, we risk to fulfill the famous prediction of Karl Marx in the opening of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And he said, of course, everybody knows it quite well, history repeats itself, the first time as a tragedy and the second as a farce. And I give the floor to Paula.
And now move to our second topic, which is on the Anthropocene, and it's more specifically how to address the concept of the Anthropocene and its relevance as a historical category within the problematic of history of science and technology. And this idea of addressing the concept of the Anthropocene is closely related to the concept of crisis. Science and technology are undoubtedly at the core of the Anthropocene. In our opinion, historians of science and technology should engage in debate on the Anthropocene, first by discussing if the concept is useful as a historical category, second, using their own analytical tools to dissect some of the assumptions behind the concept, and third, by crossing concepts used in our field of expertise with the rationale behind the Anthropocene. One of the things that troubled us the most in our first immersion in the Anthropocene debates was the realization that most accounts on the Anthropocene were, and still are, dehistoricized. That is, human agency, translated into economic and political systems, dissolves in a very generic narrative, which goes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's mystification of nature to George Orwell's dystopia of omnipresent technological surveillance. Furthermore, as far as science and technology are concerned, the idea of a quasi-autonomous technosphere is particularly close to technological determinism and oblivious of the human nature of science and technology. Finally, another disturbing implication of the historicity of the usual concept of Anthropocene is the use of the we and the us, as all human society is a homogeneous, flat, and free-floating reality. A growing number of authors have been criticizing this discourse on the Anthropocene, that inherently emphasizes the urgency of global solutions for a global problem posed by a global humanity, that is, a global humanity as a whole, intentionally leveling socioeconomic differences and concealing political conflicts. These authors propose alternative concepts to describe the so-called age of humankind, that is the we, particularly by stressing the role played by different forms of capitalism, including the so-called state capitalism, in the unbridled exploitation of natural resources, thus bringing to the forefront the divide between those who explore and those who are explored. Colonial and post-colonial studies also responded to this criticism by discussing how European science, technology, and medicine anchored a new global worldwide epistemology and ideas of progress and growth that profoundly changed the very concept of ecology, both in colonial and post-colonial periods. In this context, there is a lot of room for historians of science and technology to participate and help to reinforce human dimension in the present narratives on the Anthropocene by following the changes in natural and human landscapes, using science and technology as a heterogeneous ensemble of mechanisms that enforce and reinforce power over nature, framed by economic and political objectives. In our view, the relevant question concerning time in the Anthropocene is not the building of a chronology of events, or even the discussion of its starting point, but the addition of temporality along the perspective to the discussion in order to be able to seize the intertwined movements of different historical scales. As historians of science and technology, but the same applies to philosophers and sociologists of science and technology, we think it is our responsibility to encourage a historicized account of the Anthropocene. Furthermore, the Anthropocene framework enables historians of science and technology to test many of our concepts and theoretical apparatuses in order to assess their plasticity and robustness. Examples of such concepts are biopolitics, biopower, biofacts, technologies of the body, of the land, and of the state, the milieu intérieur, technopolitics, technoeconomics, technological determinism and its criticism, the atom network theory, and the practice theory. In a nutshell, the issue of science and technology can contribute to enrich the ongoing debate on the Anthropocene, as well as the extent to which this concept is useful for historical analysis. In what follows, we give a specific example in which we have been working. It is an example which makes clear how the input of history of science and technology may help to dissect the nature-culture-technology dichotomy and help reassess the nature of nature, which is central to the Anthropocene debate. By following the changes in natural and human landscapes using science and technology as mechanisms framed by economic and political objectives, we argue that they do not only enforce and reinforce power over nature, but they're also responsible for the demise of the utopian separation between nature and culture and technology. As such, they are behind our proposal to introduce the concept of lumpen nature. We build, of course, on an analogy to the Marxist concept of lumpen proletariat in order to highlight the demise of nature as an independent entity and to stress its constitutive technological dimension. And as such, we go a step forward from the usual idea of technologization of nature to assert the creation of a technological nature, a techno-nature, that is in fact a lumpen nature. Historians of science and technology have introduced recently concepts such as naturalization of technology, technologization of nature. They do not imply, though, a perception of nature and technology as balanced sides of a pair. In fact, in both instances, technology is the driving force, either by imposing itself as a second nature and reclaiming its status as a form of life, or by domesticating and controlling nature by transforming landscapes and ecosystems to enhance, for instance, food and energy supplies, both on local and global scales. On the other hand, philosophers and historians have been stressing all along the 20th century that past historical counts did not make room for nature. That is, there was an absence of nature per se in history and as history, in the sense that in mainstream narratives, nature is not taken as an actor. And reacting to this persistent situation, they have called attention to the visible and invisible entanglements of nature, technology, and humans. Let us be reminded of the École des Annales, Bloch, Febvre, Brodel, and historians of technology such as Krasman and Purcell, Benjamin Chadsky, the 1960s debate on the culture-nature divide, and more recent scholarship on the topic. It is having this context in mind that we propose to go a step further and introduce this notion of the technological nature. By this concept, we mean artificial and digital representations of the wild that fulfill our inborn affiliation with the environment without actually engaging with nature. Programs on wildlife while destroying the existing natural habitats, creating more perfect waves to substitute natural sounds, but also decreasing global warming by putting deflector in the Earth's orbit and not changing at all the reasons for the warming of the planet. In this sense, this new technological nature is a lumpen nature because it is deprived of its primal values and inherently framed by technology. It seems as nature, but it is no longer nature. We are aware that this technological nature contaminates the essence of what has been perceived in the past as true nature, eventually leading to its dissolution as a category. And we are reminded here of McKibben's statement, we have deprived nature of its independence, and this is fatal to its meaning. Nature's independence is its meaning. Without it, there is nothing but us. And this is a quotation from his book, The End of Nature. So we move now to the conclusion, very briefly, by crossing concepts such as crisis and Anthropocene with the theoretical framework of both STEP and Nations of Europe. Historians of science and technology can historicize and endow them with new dimensions or with dimensions which have remained so far in the dark. The relevance of local contexts, transnational expertise and objects, colonialism and imperialism are just a few examples of topics to be replaced. Addressed from a new perspective centered on Europe, but deeply critical of Eurocentrism, the consideration of the dynamic evolution of extended global networks enables to relocate on new grounds the building of local asymmetries. Following the reflections of our colleague Clapperton Mavungas in one of the first Anthropocene campuses, we extended the questioning on whose Anthropocene to whose crisis. The recognition of the dire impact of asymmetries on present-day problems calls for solutions involving an ample participation of different constituencies. The importance of history of science and technology as a particular area within humanities becomes obvious, and the role of the European Society for the History of Science in such debate is a must. Thank you so much.
Okay,